everybody, and welcome back to No Fixed Address. I'm Teo, your host, and if you're new here, this podcast is all about just kind of living in between worlds and the experiences that we have moving to a new place. As always, if you're walking to class, driving to work, or if you're just, in bed listening to this as background noise, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast today. And I hope that it's a little place where you can just disconnect for a bit. For today's episode, I actually wanted to focus on something that I've been struggling with for the past few years, which is kind of the change in between the languages that you speak. And I think this honestly came up mostly because I feel like in the last week, my accent has come up way more than usual. I feel like, which just really made me think about just like Romanian and then just how I have to translate stuff in my head before speaking in English. So I thought it would be really fun to just kind of talk about that today and also kind of link it to this idea that I've heard a lot lately of like starting over, which I'm sure I've also said before, and just the fact that it's not actually starting over, it's just kind of like starting again. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 5 of No Fixed Address. Okay, so let's start talking about languages. And I don't know if this is just me, I like to assume that it's not, but just that moment when you're in the middle of a conversation and you have this realization that, like, oh my God, I'm thinking in a completely different language. And maybe it happens, maybe it's like a word. For me, it's mostly words that just kind of slip out or a complete phrase, but like it just like slips out before you can translate it. And it's like your mind just completely switched without you even realizing. And this has also happened to me multiple times already. There's a specific phrase or saying in your native language that there's no exact translation for it in English. So you're just kind of like standing there being like, okay, give me a second. I'm trying to figure out how to like translate this to the point that you understand what I'm trying to say, but it also isn't too literal, so it just loses its meaning completely. And again, I like to think I'm not the only one who has ever experienced something like this, so I hope there's someone out there that I can relate to this. But it's moments like those that remind me like, wow, I'm not home anymore, and this is just a completely new experience for me that doesn't quite literally translate the same. And I think also for me, when I moved here to the US for university, one of the things that I was really self aware of was the fact that I wasn't used to necessarily speaking in English constantly, like for 5 months straight before I go back home. And so I used to feel so insecure of like, the grammar that I might get wrong or the accent that might slip through and just like mistakes in general. I felt so stupid honestly when those would happen because I do know English, as you guys can tell, but it's just one of the things that like them I feel like this is making me more of an outsider and more than I already feel like I am. Over time, I got more and more comfortable speaking in English to the point that like now when I go home, it happens the other way around that I'm at first thinking in English and realizing like, oh, I'm supposed to speak Romanian right now. But it kind of still strikes me sometimes the fact that there's this mix of languages in my head. And there's a study out there by a linguistic named Catherine Caldwell Harris that basically showed people react less emotionally to phrases in their second language. And if anyone's interested in reading that, just like as a parenthesis to this episode, you should be able to find it on the National Library of Medicine. If anyone is interested in doing that. But yeah, they react less emotionally to speaking in a second language or a third language. But I've also noticed that the fact that, saying I love you in English feels a lot easier than it does for me to say it in Romanian and or like swearing, for example, as well in English does not hit as hard as Romanian swearing, but that might also be just because Romanian swearing is very original. So I feel like English can never compare to that. But it's just the words are kind of wrapped in like an emotional bubble wrap or insulation, if you want. And again, I like to think that's what happens to many of us who move. We build this version of ourselves that lives inside of that bubble wrap because it's kind of easier to distance ourselves from the second language because it doesn't hold the emotional roots that our native languages do. And again, when I just got here, I was so focused on getting the language right that I really didn't expect the language switch to change me. And it wasn't just about like the vocabulary or the grammar that I was using, but it also felt like it changed my personality because in English, I feel like completely different from the person that I am when I speak Romanian. And it kind of feels sometimes like my personality has a bit of a filter because especially at the beginning I felt like there were jokes I couldn't make because I couldn't translate them well enough, or parts of myself that I couldn't fully express anymore. And it was a really strange experience because you're kind of forced to learn that when you kind of lose access to your own words, I guess, or a way that you feel comfortable expressing yourself, you start learning who you kind of are without them. And there was definitely this kind of awkward space or like period of time where I was trying to figure out who I was as my English version or like American version, I guess. And, I started like the other version of me. Like, yeah, I didn't and I still don't always have the right words to express myself, but I still found ways to connect with people. And, little by little, I started translating less and less in my head. And I kind of started feeling the different rhythm of English, I guess, which it's not perfect, still isn't, but it's enough to the point that I feel really comfortable expressing myself in English. But also with this realization came another one that actually scared me. I had it over the summer. I saw this one TikTok of a girl that was saying up until she read this one specific book, she didn't realize that she stopped dreaming in her native language. And that was just like a stop track moment for me. I was like, wait. And like everything kind of went quiet around me. I was like, wait, I also can't remember the last time I dreamt in Romanian. And that's a really scary feeling to have because, because as much as I was scared of, this new version of myself that I was building, this American version, it never quite hit me that I'm probably gonna start losing parts of my Romanian version. And again, kind of, I've talked about this in my reverse culture shocks episode, but when I came back after living abroad, I had this expectation that I'm just gonna fit right back in, like I never even left. But it wasn't like that because it didn't feel the same. And again, I kept catching myself like reaching for words that either they're not a thing in Romanian or I was just translating them directly and I was translating them wrong. And my dad loves to bring that to my attention. He's trying to always kind of ground myself and not like reminding myself not to distance myself from my Romanian roots. But it was just like such a switch for me because up until that point, I was so self-conscious of the fact that I'm speaking this second language and I'm not the most comfortable doing it. And this was a complete 180 to the point of where I was like, oh my God, I'm losing like a sense of my native language. And it felt like now there are gaps in my vocabulary for home, and I still feel it every time I go back for holidays. And again, my dad noticed, but he wasn't the only one that did. I actually have had friends tell me the first few days that I'm back home after being gone for a semester that I actually speak Romanian with an American accent, which yet again, such a scary realization to have because that was never a possibility in my head. It was never something that could happen, but it did without me meaning to. And, I laugh about it, but inside, I'm never sure which version of me they're hearing. And also, again, I now start to feel more like an outsider sometimes when I go back home, just because I feel like I can't express myself the same in Romanian anymore. And these are still feelings that I struggle with, and I'm still kind of reflecting on them. But there's a quote by Jhumpa Lahiri, which I hope I did not just completely mispronounce the name, but she wrote that a different language is a different vision of life. And I think it's true because when you start to speak in another language for long enough, you kind of start to see life differently, and not about just how you express things but also how you feel them. And I also think there's kind of this confidence that grows when you realize that you can exist in more than one language. And, it's expanding the borders of who you are as a person and your identity. And yeah, there's always going to be a small gap between, what you mean and what you're actually saying. And you might start to feel like there's a language barrier for all of the versions of yourself that you have. But I think that this gap isn't necessarily something that you have to try to fix. It's just kind of part of what makes connections human. Because even when you speak or don't speak the same language, you're never gonna understand each other perfectly. And meaning might always slip through the cracks somewhere, but there's always going to be something maybe left unsaid. But again, I feel like that's something that connects everybody. You're not alone in experiencing and feeling all of this. And there comes a point where you stop trying to translate yourself and be perfect in everything that you're saying, and you just speak. And even with the mistakes, that you maybe might be making, people still understand you and they see you. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. And that kind of brings me to the second part of today's episode, which is this myth of starting over and the idea that when you start over, you just have a completely clean slate, which is not true. And it's more so about, starting again. And I think there's a lot of us out there that kind of crave this idea of like the clean slate, that we get to have a version of ourselves that gets to leave everything behind, every awkward mistake, every messy fight that we've had with someone. Because you tell yourself, new city, new people, new version of you, you just kind of get to rewrite your story. But it never really works out that way. And when I moved abroad, I wanted that too. I told myself, okay, I'm going to be more confident. I'm going to be this person that I always wanted to grow towards and become. And for a while, maybe it worked because people don't really know the full story. They always only know what you want to share with them. And they mostly knew the versions of me that lived here in Chicago. And I didn't have to, defend my choices or have to explain my background too much. I could just kind of exist. But soon enough, I realized that you never actually like escape yourself. And I think language plays a big part in this because it kind of always forces us to bring traces of who we were before in this new chapter of our lives. Because, again, your accent, the metaphors that you use, they're all kind of little clues that betray your past. And I like to think of them kind of as fingerprints because even when you think you've kind of changed everything about yourself, your style, your personality, you're always gonna have these little things that they're never just gonna disappear and go away. So, coming to Chicago and starting my university experience here, I realized that, even as my accent maybe softened and my English vocabulary expanded, I can still feel the weight of everything that I've carried with me my whole life. My memories, my habits, my, specific way of seeing the world. And I still carry the same fears with me and insecurities. It's just, in a different time zone now. And even when I reinvented myself, my old self, I guess, always finds a way to speak again. And sometimes it happens through those kind of slips in my language when my Romanian would slip at first in conversations when I was here. But it made me realize that I can't just erase my roots, the way I've grown, but I can learn to grow in new directions. And that's not a failure. I think that's amazing. Because I think that's the real truth about starting over slash starting again. The fact that you're not erasing maybe anything or everything about yourself. You're integrating everything that you were before into this new version of yourself. Because again, when we talk about starting over, we kind of make it sound like we're deleting a file on the computer and we're opening a blank document, but it's more so as like we're editing the one that was already there. We're adding new sentences or maybe deleting a few, but we're finding ways of integrating all the languages that we've learned and all the versions that came before this one, because they're not baggage, they're layers in our identities. And I think they also help you feel more authentic. Because think about it, when you start over in a new place, you don't just lose your memories, do you? You start building on them. Your accent shifts, your humor maybe changes, and your routines adapt to this new environment that you found yourself in. But deep down, you're still carrying your first language, your first hometown, and just kind of that first sense of belonging that you're looking for in every new chapter of your life. And I think there's nothing to fix about that. That's something that should be celebrated. And one of my friends here in the US said to me, I can't remember who it was actually, but they've told me something along the lines of, you sound different when you speak English than when you speak your first language. And I've also definitely said that to people. I've said that to my boyfriend when he speaks German, or to my friends around me when they switch languages. But just to hear it said to me was kind of weird, because how can a language change my personality, right? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense, because when you kind of find yourself living in between languages, I think you start performing small versions of yourself that kind of fit into every context or friend group that you're in. And it's not because you're fake or not being authentic, but because you're, again, searching for that sense of belonging and you're trying to adapt. Because each language brings out a different piece of you. And to go back to the core of what this podcast is about, you kind of start to notice that home isn't just one language anymore. It's, again, this kind of space of in between everything that you know and that you've learned. And I think that's what makes coming back to your physical home or hometown, whatever you want to call it, so much harder the more you travel or the more time you spend away, because every new place leaves a version of you behind. And when you return, you have to bring with you all those versions at once. And they don't fit perfectly together, but they make you, a new person in a way that staying still in one singular place never could. And maybe that's the beauty of it, the fact that we can stretch ourselves across worlds and still remain whole, because we don't just start over, we just continue with new words, new meanings, and maybe a slightly different accent every time. And I think for me, that's kind of the most honest kind of reinvention that there is out there. And it's not about forgetting where you came from, it's about speaking a new language that will always carry your old one underneath. Because, the same way home isn't a fixed place, neither are you. Because in the way you think, the way you say hello, the way you miss people who live in different time zones, it's something that you carry with you. And I still catch myself saying a word or maybe a phrase that doesn't quite translate in the language that I'm speaking in. And I realize that I've built my kind of own private language. And it's one that belongs to no specific country, but to me, and the person that I became while crossing multiple places. So, if there's one thing that I've learned from living between languages and across borders and oceans, it's that you don't need to start over to become someone new, because you're already becoming constantly, all the time. So, if this is something that you're going through right now, or maybe the next time you find yourself in a new city or in a new phase of life, try to remember this, that you don't have to reinvent yourself completely. You can just translate what's already there. The best parts, the emotional parts, and even the confusing parts into a new language. Because no matter where you go, you'll always carry your own dictionary of memories. And every time you speak, you'll add a little more meaning to all of the memories or the languages that you speak. Because these languages that sometimes might seem like a barrier between people, I don't think they're a barrier at all. It's just proof that we've lived and that we've changed and that we've learned to tell our story in more than just one way. So, as always, thank you so much for listening to No Fixed Address. If this resonated with you or you just want to, reach out or just follow me, I guess you can find me on Instagram at nofixedaddress.podcast. And wherever you are, I hope that you find the words that feel like home to you. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your day or night. And I'll see you in the next episode, same place, same time. Bye, guys.